While in Latin America is often seen military rule as a solution, despite evidence of poor economic outcomes under authoritarianism.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. While has Latin America often seen military rule as a solution, despite evidence of poor economic outcomes under authoritarianism?
You want me to answer that question in English or in Spanish?
As you prefer.
English. I will do my best. Okay. Borges used to say that freedom is the space that the soul needs. So, if your soul is not very well fitted, very well developed, I think that in general you have some tendency to accept orders because you don't trust your brain, you don't trust your reason. So that's one of the reasons I think regarding people in general. But I would add that it's more than that. That idea of the dictatorship comes from what is authoritarianism. What is that? Is that somebody is making decisions for you. So you need to obey. And in order for you to be able to obey, you need to not to trust your own decisions, or at least to accept force on you. So when you have Perón, when you have Rosas was cutting heads in Argentina, when you have Videla, Onganía, Galtieri invading the Falklands, when you have in Uruguay Frente Amplio, in Chile Allende and so many, and Communist Party and Mr. Boric. When you have in Paraguay Stroessner, when you have in Brazil the militaries, you have Lula, you have Dilma. When you have Petro in Colombia, Maduro and Chavez in Venezuela, Castro's there, Ortega here, the PRI in Mexico, what's going on? Of course, there is an evident fault there. The population is not reacting against totalitarianism, against, of course, the concentration of power, statism, authoritarianism. And why is that? I think that in general there are two main causes. One is the old mysticism, the theism in your daily life, the acceptance of rules, of mandamientos in general, and not discussing them. The idea that you need to follow all this. Jesuits have been very, very influential in rural Latin America for decades and for centuries, and they and Spaniards just follow in general those precepts. So people they had tendencies to obey, and you see that in general. So to get independent judgment and to be able to challenge that, if you compare with the North, where you have several churches competing to gain the soul of a man and giving different arguments, you see a different approach. I don't care about religion here in Argentina, but when I went to Grove City, I went to the church every single day. Why? Because of the debates that were taking place there. I was enjoying them. And not because of religious causes, because they were debating ideas and moral issues. So it was very interesting to be there. Religion in Latin America has played a role, just give me a couple of more minutes, has played a role that was very significant in just telling the people just reason is uncertain in general terms, and of course the idea of obedience. And that goes also with collectivism, the idea that you need, because you need to obey the church, or you need to obey the king, or you need to obey the political party. So people were accustomed to obey. Of course, mysticism after the Greeks, after Aristotle, after Thomas de Aquino, after the Renaissance was discredited, we had the Industrial Revolution because of that. Because people start to think we have Newton because of that. So that's a good explanation of, but still, I think mysticism in that way, theism in your daily life, was defeated. You still have deism the kind of creator of the universe that a lot of people think in general, but that doesn't hurt in daily life, in discoveries, in productivity. Authoritarianism, the idea of authoritarianism was completely discredited after World War II. The Nazis lost, the Japanese lost the war, and Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 too. So the system was completely discredited. That idea of authoritarianism. You have Stalin, you have Hitler, you have Mao killing people. So that doesn't work anymore. Latin America don't follow those ideas. So the second element was also discredited. What about the third? Statism. Statism, you have La Habana, and you have Miami. You have South Korea, North Korea, East Germany, West Germany. Of course, people, they are not blind. They can see that statism doesn't work. You have the old Argentina, the remnants, and you can see it in Buenos Aires. The remnants of a great civilization. We destroy it, but still there is an atmosphere, intellectual atmosphere in the country, that you can smell it in this city. And why? Because we have the old Argentina. They know why people why having the Industrial Revolution, why having this enormous achievements of Argentina, people just do not mention that. Because the fourth and last battle that has, according to me, has not been fought is altruism. The idea of that you have to sacrifice yourself, not in the Christian sense that you need to value your neighbor as you value yourself, in the idea of sacrifice, in the Kantian idea, duty, in the Comte idea. That idea that you need, if you are only moral if you sacrifice yourself for the common good, for the poor, for the Aryan race, or for the Labour Party, or the laborer. So that concept has not been fought, I think, in Latin America. Your hero is Mother Teresa, is not Steve Jobs. Your hero is Guevara, despite the fact that he was a serial killer, but he was sacrificing himself in Bolivia, fighting for the common good. So he became a hero. You see them in the church. But you don't have the picture there of Bezos or Elon Musk. So you have two different images in Latin America. And my thesis is that unless we fight altruism and the right to live your own life, to be happy, to take care of your own property, and to deal with each other in terms of contracts, in terms of seduction, as Walter Williams used to say, if you make me feel good, I will make you feel good, instead of rape. If you don't make me feel good, I will make you feel bad. I have some music behind me. That's moving me. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, the history of militarism and authoritarianism is very long in Latin America, because after independence, many of the countries continued with military governments. So it really begins with history, as opposed to the USA that basically tried to form democratic republican institutions. In Latin America, we continued with a feudalistic, militaristic organization. So it has to do a lot with the history on one side. Also, let me give you a personal example, because many of these things, for better and for worse, also come from Spain. My family is Spanish, and they left Spain when Spain was the last fascist country in Europe. As you probably know, Francisco Franco, he was a fascist. He was in power until he died in 1975. And so my parents left Spain when Spain was poor, fascist dictatorship. And they moved to Venezuela, that was an incredibly wealthy democratic country. It was the wealthiest country in South America in the 1950s and 60s. No other country had the wealth that Venezuela had. And so my father and my mother went to Venezuela, where I was born. Now, it's just the opposite. Venezuela is no longer democratic and is no longer wealthy. It is incredibly poor communist dictatorship. Also, when I talk about dictatorship, there are dictatorships from the right or from the left. In the Spanish Civil War, it was the communists supported by Russia and the fascists supported by Hitler. There was really no winning side because either the communists or the fascists were bad alternatives. Fortunately, when Franco died, a new king came to power and he led the country into a constitutional monarchy based on Great Britain. So this was an important change for the history of Spain. But again, now Venezuela has a horrible militaristic, totalitarian communist regime that has caused the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world today. 9 million refugees. 9 million. A quarter of the population of Venezuela have had to leave. Actually, out of the 9 million, I'll give you the round numbers, 2 million are in Colombia, 1 million in Ecuador, 1 million in Peru, 500,000 in Chile, 500,000 here in Argentina, 500,000 in Mexico, 500,000 in the USA, and 500,000 in Spain, where I'm living. And I want to say that I'm so grateful to Argentina because, as you probably know, something that should be a movie in Hollywood, a movie, is some of the opposition leaders had to take refuge because they were going to be taken by Maduro and the communists. So they looked for refuge in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas. So 6 refugees, 6 hostages stayed for over 1 year and a half in the Argentinian embassy. And thanks to Javier Milei, you know, they could stay safely until an incredible secret operation, Hollywood style, took place. I don't know if you are aware of this, but this was incredible. The CIA, the FBI, with the Mossad from Iran and the Secret Service of Argentina managed to take the hostages from the center of Caracas out of the country. And the government didn't know Venezuela. Actually, let me tell you, the dictator of Venezuela, Maduro, was in Moscow when this happened. He was totally surprised. He's in Moscow, and Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, put a tweet. We have freed the hostages in Venezuela, and they have been taken to the USA. This is absolutely incredible. This is Hollywood. This is really Hollywood, except that it is reality. And anyway, so I'm thankful also to the other MAGA country. Not only to Argentina, but to the USA, because the US government has put the highest reward ever in history for Nicolás Maduro. This was announced last week, $50 million to capture the criminal Nicolás Maduro. So I'm really grateful for the USA and for Argentina to get rid of this horrible militaristic authoritarian regime in Venezuela. Sorry for the sentimental content, but a quarter of Venezuelans had to leave Venezuela. Imagine, this is a human tragedy of no precedent.
Hello. According to my presentation, I am going to talk a little bit in Spanish. Bueno, para responder la pregunta, me gustaría situar algunos elementos que considero que son fundamentales dentro de nuestra cultura hispánica y sobre todo lo que ha ocurrido acá en nuestro continente. Tenemos un fenómeno de falta de confianza interpersonal muy fuerte, que eso obviamente debilita la creación de instituciones sólidas. Y por ese mismo motivo no podemos o tenemos una tendencia a buscar caudillos y líderes que vengan a solucionar materias de manera mágica. Yo creo que esto, falta de confianza interpersonal, es un fenómeno que es muy relevante para el desarrollo de instituciones sólidas, contratos abiertos y también respetar las reglas. Yo creo que esa misma razón también genera que hayan problemas en entender lo que es el derecho de propiedad y separarlo también de la acción del Estado. Otra característica que también considero que es importante destacar es que en nuestro continente, cuando ha habido consenso sobre el libre mercado y los beneficios de este, es donde los países han dado un despegue en sus relaciones económicas, sus relaciones internacionales, y han tenido también un periodo mayor de paz social. Cuando ese consenso se rompe, vamos al caso chileno, obviamente tienes un problema de cohesión social y empieza el declive de la confianza sobre las instituciones, sobre los organismos públicos y también sobre la empresa. Y eso es muy claro, por lo menos lo que vivimos en Chile desde el 2019, podríamos situarlo antes, pero el 2019 con las revueltas, el proceso insurreccional que vivimos. Creo también, y aquí yo sostengo también, le doy soporte a una tesis que hay de Stanford del investigador Alberto Díaz, que hay también un sesgo, como decía Eduardo, colonial en nuestro continente, que esa relación de dependencia y de obediencia está arraigada también en cierta medida en nuestra cultura. Sin embargo, en contraste con ello, cuando hay un consenso de que los mercados abiertos y libres son los que dan prosperidad, nos permite dar ese salto y salirnos un poco de ese sesgo colonial. Por otro lado, y para ir cerrando también esta intervención, tenemos este sesgo de legalismo y de normativismo muy arraigado, en el cual, dado que no tenemos confianza interpersonal muy fuerte, tenemos que normarlo todo, escribirlo todo, y eso obviamente genera problemas en la confianza en los contratos y también el desarrollo de mercados libres y abiertos. Y para cerrar la idea, también comentarles que cuando se generan estas pérdidas de consenso social sobre las ideas de la libertad y el libre mercado, aparecen también grupos extremistas que buscan erosionar las instituciones que al menos sostenían este proceso de mejoras de mercado, mejoras en calidad de vida, etc. Y obviamente estos grupos, que usualmente son marginados de la política formal, son los que al menos nosotros tratamos en el libro que publicamos, que se llama Proceso Insurreccional, Asedio a las Democracias Liberales, espero pronto que esté en inglés también, donde tratamos cómo estos grupos radicalizados de izquierdas van erosionando la confianza social, las instituciones, y que no necesariamente tienen objetivos político-partidistas, sino que el afán es mantener un estado de inestabilidad dentro del proceso político o de la confianza social. Y estos grupos obviamente no tienen una militancia arraigada en ciertos partidos, son grupos que funcionan casi de manera espontánea. Hay grupos de anarcocomunistas que están dentro de las universidades, y cuando ellos toman mayor poder, cuando entienden que las reglas del Estado de Derecho no funcionan, es donde más auge van teniendo y van socavando las instituciones.
Thank you so much. We have 3 minutes left, so I need a very short answer. What institutional traps keep Latin American countries authoritarian?
Say it again, please.
Yes. What institutional traps keep Latin American countries authoritarian? Very short answer.
And you want to start? I want to think.
It is not an easy question, but I am thinking about laws. What he said, in Latin America, in many countries we say, for our friends, this is politician, which is very sad, for our friends, everything. For our enemies, nothing. And for the rest, the law. So that is part of the problem.
I think that the most important way to protect our civilian and constitutional order is promote strong institutions and with cultural values of liberty inside the institutions. Without this, we can't have a consensus in our society.
What is the difference between US and different countries in Europe and England in general? The concept of, they had John Locke, they had Benjamin Franklin, they had Hamilton, Jefferson, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. They have the Bill of Rights. They understood the idea of individual rights. So that idea of individual rights, that you are entitled to your own happiness, that you can own the fruits of your labor, those ideas were not very well developed in general, and they were conditioned by the idea that necessity creates rights. If you see Cristina Kirchner, main spot of propaganda is donde hay una necesidad hay un derecho. If you see Dilma, todo pelo social. If you see Maduro, you see all these kind of arguments, they are based on an altruistic ethic, the idea of sacrifice for the common good. So you are not entitled to your own life, you need to give up. You are a selfish pig trying to pursue your capitalistic greed and things like that.
Thank you so much for the speakers. Do we have some minutes for question and answers from the public?
Remember to keep them brief, please.
Yes. First of all, as always, an excellent panel, excellent discussion. I thought Mr. Marty made a particularly interesting point at the beginning of the talk about perhaps people's brains not being properly developed. When East Germany was reunified with West Germany, there were stories coming out about East Germans going into supermarkets, and they were bewildered by the extraordinary variety of the goods and services, and they would actually, they'd freeze up because they couldn't make decisions. There were too many decisions for them to make. So thank you for a very interesting.
Let me add just one sentence. When I went to Grove City and I went to the supermarkets in America compared with the supermarkets in Argentina at that time, I felt the same. And I was invited by several fraternities and sororities to go to different parties. Which is the most popular? You need to choose. It's according to you. To take decisions, you need to learn to do it. It's not easy.
Hi. So I'm from Colombia, and I think that my country is a very special study case, because unlike Argentina, Chile, and other Latin American countries, throughout the 20th century we didn't have a dictatorship, but we had a violent outbreak of political violence, and we have lived in a civil war for about 60 years. So I would like to know what are your thoughts about that, because of in the Colombian spectrum, and also we still live in this political violence. Just recently this week a presidential candidate was killed. So this is my comment, like, what do you think about that? Why maybe Colombia is kind of an exception to a rule, but not in the whole way? And also, like, do you think that the persecution that the left has lived because of the far right, or the right that is not necessarily liberal, persecutions during the dictatorships, are the things that are now the cause that legitimize their speech, and that's why they're winning recently? But that's what I want to know your thoughts.
Well, I have a very special kind of answer, in the sense that I work on longevity. And I believe that the longer we live, the more peaceful we need to become. Actually, this comes from evolutionary biology. When you have shorter lives, you compete. If you live longer and longer, the optimum strategy is to be peaceful. So now, Colombia has a low life expectancy. when you compare this to other countries, Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world today, and it's an incredibly peaceful country. Anyway, this is not the full answer to your question, but I just had to plug in my book. My book is called The Death of Death, and I do talk about that, actually. I do talk about that seriously, that longer lives will make us more peaceful, cleaner also environmentally. We are going to be into a better world the longer we live, because we will suffer from the results. You know, not our children or our grandchildren that we will not see maybe. We are going to suffer from the things that we do or we don't do. That is why living longer, becoming even immortal, will make us peaceful, cleaner, more tolerant, and better for humanity in general. So I want Colombians to live longer and longer and longer.
Mark Schauser.
Just one second. Did you want to add something?
Quiero complementar un poco la idea. Dentro del proceso latinoamericano de revueltas, hemos detectado por lo menos 10 puntos que las izquierdas radicales utilizan para desestabilizar el sistema. Por ejemplo, los detonantes, que son alguna política social en la cual grupos más radicalizados se oponen, y cuando toman ciertas protestas y adquieren legitimidad social, sea justa o no justa para el proceso social, depende del tipo de reacción gubernamental, si es que se enciende la chispa para poder seguir avanzando en dicho propósito. Y esto suele tener como consecuencia la búsqueda por ciertos grupos políticos de cambiar el orden constitucional cuando se ve que hay grietas y fisuras dentro del sistema, es decir, que no se está respetando el Estado de Derecho, si es que no, en virtud de tu acción violenta, saqueando un supermercado, por ejemplo, etc. No hay consecuencias, el proceso continúa. Entonces, entender cómo actúan estos grupos también es fundamental para discutir cuáles son los límites o la naturaleza del Estado de Derecho. Yo creo que eso nos falta bastante.
Thank you.
Yes. So my question is about the biggest tragedy since Cuba turned communist, and that is Venezuela. Jose, you mentioned Venezuela, but you didn't tell us how this happened. How is it that a country that had a long tradition since Simón Bolívar of a democratic capitalist country could go to total control by the Marxist socialist communists in Venezuela? Go through some of the steps that they took, that Chavez took, and others leading up to this gradual loss of freedom. I believe when the Economic Freedom Index first was proposed or listed, Venezuela was listed as one of the highest countries with the highest level of economic freedom, and now is at the bottom of the list. So go give us a couple of steps on how this happened.
Well, Mark, thank you very much, and because you also know Venezuela very well. If I'm not mistaken, you were almost 2 years in Venezuela, and your Spanish is very good. So, thank you for asking in English anyway. You are totally right. When my parents left Spain, Venezuela was very rich, very wealthy, very democratic. It was the example of democracy in Latin America. The constitution was so positive that even in Spain, when Franco died and Spain wrote his constitution, they copied the Venezuelan constitution. So it was a truly international example of democracy. But unfortunately, I guess there was a lot of corruption because of the petroleum industry. The petroleum industry, you can see this in the Arab world also, in many countries, when you have a single source of income, it immediately creates corruption. Other countries that are more diversified are more difficult to be corrupt, but in the petroleum industry, just one single resource. that provided 80% of the foreign reserves, the exports and everything. So petroleum was the cause of the problem. It is called the Dutch disease, actually, because the Dutch, in the Netherlands, they had the same when they were producing oil and gas. Anyway, this Dutch disease, everything centralized, was the cause of the problem. Adam Smith used to say that when you have the income distributed, it is more difficult for one single player to be corrupt if you have it distributed. But if you have it all centralized, then it is very easy to get corrupt. So I do think part of the problem was the petroleum industry being taken over by the state, because it was private. When it began, actually the USA had many companies, and the British, and the Dutch. So it was all international petroleum system. But then the government said, oh, we need to take this. So the government corrupted itself, and more corruption. It was like a vicious cycle. And then sadly, a populist, Chavez, came out and he said, I will finish with corruption. And now Venezuela is the most corrupt country in South America, sadly, with 9 million people, a quarter of the population in exile. This is to cry and to cry and to cry.
Eduardo, do you have any additional comment?
My answer is that in Cuba, they didn't know how to fight the intellectual battle, the cultural battle. That's why they lost. So just one populist come here with some problems, just with some propaganda and some populist arguments, and people follow him. So unless you know how to fight that battle, you will lose. Why we had the 20th century, the 2 World War Wars? Because we didn't know how to defend individual rights. Because you had John Stuart Mill, or you had Bentham, or you had the idol of Borges, Spencer, Herbert Spencer, saying giving utilitarian arguments. If you don't know how to defend individual rights, if you don't know how to explain why a man has rights, so people just with some specific redistribution of wealth, or populism, or just equality, or fraternity, or whatever, common good, they will advance on your liberties. And if you don't give intellectual arguments, they could keep going. You have them in Harvard. Take a look to John Rawls. Take a look to George Sandel. Read them and take a look what they are suggesting. So you lose your societies unless you know how to fight. And in order for you to fight, you need to have mainly just ethical arguments. You need to learn how to defend capitalism from a moral point of view. So I think that in general in Latin America, that's quick. We had Mises here. We had Milton Friedman. Hayek visited us. We had a little Center for Studies on Liberty created by Venegas Lynch's father. We had people just reading ideas on liberty, small group, but we fought. So we had 4 million people in the streets who were trying to take the press over there, or 5 million. The Venezuelans too. You had some people there, but too late. They took the press. If you took the press, you don't have a room to argue. So you lose your country finally. It's a cultural battle. The heart of Latin America is in ideas. So I think that in Argentina we are fighting that battle. That's why you see some results now.
Thanks so much. 20 seconds.
Sure. Well, in complement with these ideas, I need to agree that we cannot ignore the power capacity of the radical left in our continent. They have an organization, they promote different ideas in social movements, they have very big ideas to promote socialism in these different type of groups, and we need to understand the philosophy of all these type of groups and the new radical left and post-structural ideas of this left. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the speakers. Thank you.